As a bank that focuses on business, we work with business leaders all day, every day. We have a front row seat to what's working and what has potential. The First Business Bank podcast is dedicated to sharing insights to help you work better, smarter, and faster to achieve your goals. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to another First Business Bank podcast. I'm Kevin Kane, and I'll be your host for today's episode, Workforce Challenges for Manufacturers. To help us explore this topic, I'm joined by George Bureau, Vice President of Consulting for WMEP Manufacturing Solutions. George, welcome. Before we dig in, for our listeners who may not be familiar with WMEP, can you share a little bit about the focus of your organization and a little bit about your background for us?
Absolutely, Kevin. And again, thank you for the introduction and good morning, everyone. Again, my name is George Bureau, Vice President of Consulting. Let me talk about a little bit about Wisconsin Manufacturing Extension Partnership. That's what the WMEP stands for. We're a private nonprofit consulting group focused on helping Wisconsin manufacturing be successful in building value, delivering value, in winning in the marketplace. And we've been doing that for over 25 years. Based in Madison, we have coverage around the state and work every day out in manufacturing. So again, happy to be here this morning, Kevin.
Terrific. So kind of to follow, you've got your ear to the ground, and we do as well at First Business Bank as we're talking to clients and prospects. Virtually all manufacturers right now in Wisconsin are experiencing challenges around their workforce. Could be keeping the talent they have, replacing workers who have retired or have left, or finding new employees to support the growth of their businesses. But again, everybody's got this significant headwind in terms of finding that talent. George, from your point of view, what sort of brought us to this point in terms of where we're at?
Well, Kevin, I think it's important to take kind of a walk past memory lane, down memory lane. This issue really started to build in the mid to late 1990s. At that time, the cry was manufacturers were having trouble and problems finding skilled workers. Over time, what's happened, we've seen that problem move from lack of skilled workers to I can't find workers. We are currently seeing some new challenges regarding affordability. And if you think back, what's the drivers of all this? Well, the big elephant in the room is demographics, particularly the retirement of the baby boomer generation. Subsequent generations are generally smaller as far as sheer numbers, which makes it more difficult. So the pool to replace retiring workers is smaller than the pool it is replacing. So what we're seeing is the workforce is getting older. And then throw into this wrinkle that happened, believe it or not, 2 years next month, COVID-19. And COVID-19 really changed dynamics on top of this. It changed the dynamics about attitudes towards work. I think a lot of people reevaluated, particularly if they had family members who were sick. They reevaluated what they wanted to do with their career, where they wanted to go, most importantly, work-life balance. And subsequent to that, you'll read the new term for that is the Great Resignation. That's been pretty much in the press recently. And also on top of this was supply chain and supply chain issues caused by many times undermanned manufacturing centers because of people being out for COVID-related health issues. Increased demand that happened, particularly during the crisis. So a lot of pressure put on the supply chain, both overseas as far as some raw materials and components, as well as in the state of Wisconsin. So the pressure on the supply chain has also caused manufacturers to be very busy at a time that they also have workforce challenges to be able to get enough people and to have enough people with the skills. So all those have really combined to create this workforce crisis, Kevin, that we're seeing. So again, the big drivers, demographics, compounded by COVID-19, compounded by the supply chain issues, and I think coming soon in the horizon, which we're hearing a lot about now, is inflation. And that'll be probably a new piece in the mix. So that's what really created the challenge, Kevin, that we're seeing.
Got it. And I might want to, a little bit later in our conversation, George, return to some of those themes if we've got a little more time. But
sure.
One quick sidebar, I guess, is everything that you described. Obviously, we're here in Wisconsin. We're focused on that. Do you think that those issues that you described, are we unique in that regard? Is this something that is all over the place? I'm just curious about if you have a view on that.
Well, one of the beauties of WMEP is we are part of the Manufacturing Extension Partnership family of NIST, which is a department of the U.S. Department of Commerce, where we have that affiliation. So there's centers that are in all 50 states. This challenge, Kevin, goes across the country. It's particularly acute in manufacturing heavy state economies like Wisconsin. And the good news is, we have some things that work in our favor. But indeed, this issue of the sheer number of people, the skills to match it, and what COVID has done to it, pretty much cuts across the board.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
So back to kind of that context that you described, the demographics, the
Right.
supply chain,
Mm-hmm.
those things. With that background, what is a manufacturing firm? What are they supposed to do? Where do you even begin if you're running a manufacturing firm and are confronted with these challenges?
You think about it this way, there's some options. One is we could do nothing. That is an option. That's a decision that you can make, which I'd strongly suggest you don't do, and in essence become that victim. But I think there's a number of things that a manufacturer can do. And what I'd like to do is have everyone in the audience kind of visualize the following. Consultants are famous for putting diagrams together. So draw a line across a piece of paper, and underneath are things that we have less control over or no control. Above the lines are things we can control. And so if you think about some of the factors, Kevin, we just talked about, we can't control overall demographics at a state level or an individual manufacturer. We certainly can't influence the curve as it relates to, the next variant of COVID, et cetera. So those things are truly out of our control. But there are some things we can influence, which we'll come back and touch on. But most importantly, there are things that we can control. And those really wrap around three areas, Kevin, I think. And that comes back to what we do from a recruiting perspective. How do we do more with less? Or how do we redeploy? And lastly, what can we do regarding retention? So three big areas that I think can certainly give a sense of more control on how to deal with the situation to a manufacturer.
Okay. And so maybe to follow on that, I think I'm tracking with some of the things
Sure.
you're describing there. So how, for example, would automation fit into this equation?
So example, when you think about redeploying, if I talk to many manufacturers, in fact, we did this about 6 weeks ago, and we get data every day. It's very common for a given manufacturer to have 10, 20 positions open. Now, bear in mind, again, coming back to the workforce shortage, that means the remaining people there might be working even harder, hopefully not putting in forever overtime, but certainly working harder. But when you have open positions like that are difficult to fill, you're looking in the outside market. What automation could do is it could take responsibilities and roles that are boring, monotonous, perhaps dangerous or dirty. Let automation do that work, and then take the people that were in those positions, upskill them, give them a chance to grow in their career, and fill other positions. So it's a way in essence to automation becomes part of a solution. It's not about automation. It's what it enables. It enables you to free up human resources and put them in areas of your business that you can generate more value, where you have chronic inability to find those people to fill those roles. And also, most importantly, gives your current workforce, the people that are impacted, a chance to grow in their careers.
Okay. And maybe the follow on then, if I think about automation, and certainly in our business, among other things, we provide financing solutions, and so that perhaps is where I'm going. But what about access to capital? If I think about automation, love the idea, it makes perfect sense. But talk to me a little bit, and our listeners, about how access to capital drives some of those.
Absolutely.
I'll call it access to those solutions, if you will.
Well, if you think about some of our solutions and how we redeploy is going to require investment. Investment's going to require typically capital. Being an East Coast guy that was planted into the Midwest tends to be more risk averse. And part of what our what we try to do working with manufacturers is to understand those risks, mitigate the risks, so they feel more comfortable to take on, take on financing, take on loans, again, for generally very fast payback, high payback automation. And automation, as we talk about, Kevin, doesn't always mean robots. It could be conveying systems. It could be you name it, control systems that you put in, all with a sense, again, that you can actually reduce your overall cost, free up labor, redeploy that labor. But again, it comes back into making sure I'm comfortable, to make that investment. And that's where, again, we as partners to manufacturing, from a First Business Bank and a WMEP perspective, can work with them to show them that path.
Right. Yeah, and then part of what I think you're describing is, that sort of analysis that goes into,
Right.
okay, what might be required, what is the hurdle for that, for return on that investment as an option to I like the word you use, mitigate some of
Exactly.
the issues that come into play. Kind of following from there too, any other mitigants, I'll keep with that word, but any other mitigants that come into play? We've talked about access to capital and how you might apply that. Talked about automation. And by the way, I appreciate the distinction you made between it isn't always the multi-million-dollar robotic system, but there may be some intermediate solutions that move you in that direction, or plant configuration that help. But any other mitigants that might come into play beyond access to capital and automation that you've just touched on, George?
Well, particularly for, to mitigate risk, is looking at your overall processes. And again, when I mentioned about doing more with less, it can, and you think about it, I mentioned, Kevin, one of our drivers of the whole situation, which is a top two concern for manufacturers, is supply chain concerns.
Right.
And if we can reduce the amount of scrap that is produced by our facilities, part of that is, again, how do we run at higher quality rates, higher productivity rates to reduce scrap? That reduces the risk I have on supply chain. So that's another example where, again, there's proven processes around Lean and Six Sigma that you can use to attack that, or even taking time and space out of operations, reduce the number of steps, which again helps reduce risk, Kevin.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, sounds good. Actually, if we could touch on supply chain, you've brought that
Sure.
forward a couple times. So, and it's what you described earlier. So the idea that, okay, supply chain, that might be the second or third most significant issue confronting manufacturers. But with that, we've certainly heard from companies that they're reassessing how they source product or material, much of which may have been coming from overseas. And so the word onshoring, we hear fairly often. Where I'm going with that is everything you've just described in terms of the workforce challenges, onshoring, I love the idea, but it feels like that would actually amplify or make some of these issues even more problematic. Do you see it the same way? And what's some of the discussion around kind of maybe the conflict between, hey, we want to shorten our supply chain or bring it back domestically, but yeah, talk to me about that aspect of things, if you would.
Well, I think first it comes back, before we even get into the onshoring, offshoring, is
Okay.
truly understand where are our risks from a supply chain perspective.
Okay.
What are our critical components? What is our sourcing philosophy? If we have critical components that we have periodic issues with regard to delivery or inflationary increases that are out of control, what have we done to make sure that we have backup sources as a good starting point? And then from there to truly weigh, if you look at the needs of your business, treat an onshore no different than a nearshore, nor different than an offshore, as it relates to does a potential supplier meet those criteria? Walk before you run with it, and make
Okay.
sure, again, that it's sustainable in your business model is what we'd recommend.
Makes
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah.
Any other, if you think about, again, as you described at the beginning of our conversation, day in and day out, WMEP is talking to companies and manufacturers specifically throughout the state. Any common themes or strategies that you have seen where a company has had more success in the hunt
Oh,
for talent?
absolutely.
And perhaps it's tied into some of the things you've already described, George, but that would be an interesting perspective.
Let me sketch a few things. Number one is if I look at there are companies out there that are navigating this pretty successfully. They tend to be pretty quiet, don't say very much because they are. And I guess one of my key challenges for any manufacturer listen to this is is don't accept your fair share in this case. Is workforce out there. Manufacturing is in a good position with relatively high paying jobs. We're over that paradigm of dark and dingy, and it's incumbent upon all of us to get that word out there that we can compete with retail, we can compete, in other spaces and pull workers in. But if I look at it, number one is how do we position our company from a perspective of what our value proposition is? Why should I come work for your company, and what makes you different and special? And the more company can do that, it makes it easier to say, why should I come apply? Secondly, is rather than wait for people to come to us, where do they hang out? Where are the people? Who is that persona that we're looking for? And proactively go after them. In other words, don't fish anywhere in the creek. Go where the fish are best biting. Go there with a compelling message. And then from
Okay.
the perspective, okay, sorry, Kevin.
No,
Yeah.
go ahead. No, go ahead. Keep going.
No, and one last thing is when you recruit somebody into your firm, think about what that first 1-2 weeks are like. Make it special. You want the significant other, their families to say, wow, they have treated mom nicely. This is a great place. Because the more you have your employees singing the praises of what you do, and in your company, the more effective you're going to be at this, Kevin. I could go on to the next step, but you have a question.
Yeah, well, and actually, I think it ties in because what I was going to share is that a question that we hear consistently from our clients, and our focus at First Business Bank is solidly in the middle market. It's not a mid corporate, it's not a large corporate client. And one of the things we hear from companies is, hey, how can we possibly compete for talent with larger organizations that have deeper pockets, more resources? And that is on their mind, and I think you sort of touched on that a moment ago when you were talking about, I'll use the word, the employee experience, but do you have any additional thoughts on how do the
Yes.
smaller
Mhm.
but good companies fight for that talent, knowing that there's probably somebody down the street that's a bit bigger and has is going to write a bigger check, just not in
Yeah.
terms of compensation, if you will.
Well, absolutely. And I think one of the places it starts, if we really dial it back, let's look at the culture that we spend. Because the reality is we spend our best waking hours in a work situation typically. And if you think about it, particularly with the younger generations, working for a company that has true purpose, that the products make a difference in the world that we live in, that's a big deal. And I'll challenge anyone, particularly manufacturing, to say that, compare that to working in a distribution center where you load pallets on a truck. You know, I'll use a real life example of walking into a company in the Northeast Wisconsin where, specific machine parts are used in high pressure situations that if that particular piece fails, there's an explosion that hurts a lot of people. Well, they've made that story clear to their employees. They take extreme pride in workmanship and what they do with their products because they know what it's being used for, whether it be in jet engine type of parts or high pressure vessels, for example. So the more we can make, that sets us apart, coming back to the purpose, why are we here and that we make a difference in the world? That's a great place to start, Kevin, a
Yeah.
foundation to build on.
Yeah, I really like that approach, and my guess would be too, if you have a purpose-driven organization where the folks there can understand how what they do for that company and how that fits into, I'll call it a mission. Maybe that's not quite the best word, but I'm guessing that if you have an employee who has that perspective, it probably helps on the turnover side of the equation too. That a client, or excuse me, an employee who has that view of the culture is more likely to stay with a company versus jumping to another opportunity for a couple dollars more. So
Exactly.
yeah.
And think about that's where all these pieces fit together. What we do for engagement of employees, to gauge their hearts and minds, to show them that they have a career they can grow in, that they can take pride in. There are work situations out there where an employee doesn't want to bring their family in because they're ashamed of their working conditions. Just, put yourself in their shoes versus imagine the opposite, where, they have a family could come in and tour and they're showing their workstations, they're showing the beautiful place where they eat lunch. It doesn't have to be big and expensive. But again, the more we can do that and engage their minds and hearts, the better retain them. Because one of our challenges for any organization, be it manufacturing or other, is we typically hire in a certain geographic market. What is our reputation? Not what we think it is, but what truly is our reputation? And just imagine, it will get warm in Wisconsin again. So now it's May, and there's a barbecue going on, Kevin, and a number of your employees are there, and they're talking to their friends, and they're saying, "This is a really cool place to work. The exciting things that we're doing. It's a great place. I could see myself working here in 10 more years. You need to come work here." That to me is where you've reached it.
Yeah.
That your people are singing the praises for you.
It's a great example.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe as we kind of wind up on a couple,
Sure.
One other thing that comes to mind is bigger picture. Is your view and WMEP's view, is the experience that we've just spent the last 15, 20 minutes talking through of that manufacturers are seeing, is it a temporary or a transitory issue? Will it be resolved in the next year or two? What's your perspective on that?
Well, the sheer numbers alone mean mathematically we're going to see this for at least 5 more years.
Okay.
And so again, I highly encourage any manufacturer, if you haven't dealt with this yet, this is a good time to do it, because it's going to remain a challenge. And so, just from a workforce, numbers of people challenge that we have. And then if you look at the supply chain and other issues, again, they may not be short-lived, and inflation is an unknown right now as to how long. But all the things we're talking about to really firm up, to define what it's like as a place to come work for, to recruit, that we really move to upskill people and add value, and use automation and other methodologies to do more with less, and really work to engage and retain. That's a winning formula for regardless, Kevin, where we see the market 2 or 5 years from now.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Good advice. Any other final thoughts or advice you might have for our listeners, the manufacturers here in the state?
The one last challenge I have for any one of us is pretend you're a person applying to your company. Find out what the experience is like. Find out whether the phone is answered. Look and see whether the hiring sign has rust on it because it's been out there for the last 14 weeks. See if your website's updated, doesn't have a job posting that went up last May. And look at it and say, do we have an exciting story to tell? Ask people how the onboarding process is going. Really find out, via stay interviews as to why people stay here. And keep working on those things incrementally, and you'd be surprised how quickly you can make improvement. So that would be my last thought. Don't wait for this to go away. Grab a hold of it and control what you can control, as we certainly recommend.
Sounds good. So incredibly complicated and complex topic. We've really barely scratched the surface, I would say. And so to that end, we're planning several more podcast installments in coming weeks on this topic. And so, George, if I can pass it back to you for a moment, can you give us a little bit of a sneak preview about the next few episodes and the themes that we're going to address?
Exactly. Well, the next episode we're going to talk, again, we've kind of mentioned 3 R's several times to keep it easy. I like to simplify things. We're going to talk a little bit about recruitment, particularly how do we position our company? How do we set ourselves apart? How do we win differentially in the marketplace? And we've got some experts that can help in that area and offer some advice and from stories. We are going to come back and talk about from a redeploy perspective, Kevin, and that is really how do we use automation? How do we use other methods, continuous improvement, in order to allow us to close unfilled positions, but more importantly, upskill people, offer growth opportunities, because it could be a real win-win, take some pressure off of some of the supply chain challenges.
Yep.
And lastly, we'll come back and talk about retention. And again, retention really first starts with engagement. And we haven't talked a lot about it, but there's a really important role of leadership in all this, particularly first line leaders. And then, kind of the purpose-driven organization, Kevin. And we'll come talk about the engagement and then what things we can do around retention. And again, those are the three areas that we see that manufacturers have the most control over. Others areas they can influence, but this is certainly where we would suggest is the biggest bang for right now.
Sounds good. And to your point, we'll have some additional guests joining for those three podcasts here in the next 3 or 4 weeks. So, George, thank you again for joining us today and for sharing your insights on this. It's a huge issue. It's the number one thing, again, that we hear about. And we appreciate the partnership that First Business Bank has with WMEP. You guys are doing terrific work, and it makes a huge difference. And as well, I'd like to finish by thanking those that are listening to the podcast. Be sure to visit us at firstbusiness.bank to explore some of the other resources we offer business owners and leaders to help them succeed. And we invite you to experience the advantage with First Business Bank. So thank you again, George.
Kevin,
much
thank you, and
appreciate
go Wisconsin Manufacturing. We appreciate it.
Okay, talk to
All
you
right.
soon.
Thank
Bye.
you. Okay, bye.
If you want more content like what you just heard delivered straight to your inbox, go to firstbusinessbankpodcast.com. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the First Business Bank podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave a quick rating of the show. Thanks so much for listening. First Business Bank, member FDIC.